Indiana Jones out and it not being all that successful, oops, I thought it was time to talk about the entire franchise. I was gonna put one whole entire big video, but I decided that, God, there was enough to talk about the whole show of the Young Indiana Jones Adventures for one video. But I decided to get to one big long video about the adventures / chronicles of the Young Indiana Jones Adventures, depending on which version you're watching. First though, for context, Indiana Jones of course started with Raiders of the Lost Ark. This series has been incredibly successful, spanning a whole bunch of novels that I'll vaguely talk about as we go along, and also a bunch of video games made by LucasArts, which at this time for most of this wasn't owned by Disney, but now is. Raiders would span, of course, two sequels being Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and later The Last Crusade, and seemingly would kind of dry up before the eventual 2008 Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and the more recent, as mentioned, Dial of Destiny. There would be something right in the middle of it. That being Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. While filming the trilogy of Indiana Jones, George Lucas was asked multiple times what the childhood of Indiana Jones was, and throughout the years he eventually would make this big diagram of the years from when he was born, all the way up until the first movie, of a whole bunch of different adventures of Indiana Jones and what he did and what kind of historical people he met during his weird, strange adventures. This would lead us into the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Now, of course, there's supposed to be 70 whole adventures of what was supposed to be a thing, but ultimately, the ratings weren't good enough to really continue it into a third season. Only 30-ish adventures of the 70 written down were really made, with there being majorly 4 television films that really ended off the series that were a merging of plot lines that were going to be a thing and their own separate episodes merged into one, for 4 TV films that ended off the series. The series, as it was released, went multiple parts of Indiana Jones' life, not going through chronologically. However, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles was then compiled into The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones and was released for VHS chronologically. You can find all these adventures, again labeled chronologically, on Disney+. As they were originally released on TV, though you can't quite find these anymore. Personally, I feel like the Adventures of Young Indiana Jones edit of it is much better and is just the kind of right way to watch it. And again, fully chronologically. It does make things a little bit weird, but then again, even watching it by release order, you'd still have the tonal whiplash that is this series. So there really is no right way of watching it, but that being said, there is lots to unpack about the Young Indiana Jones adventures. Like, oh my god, lots to unpack. Now, though we didn't get the adventures that were eventually going to lead us into the younger versions of characters that we know from the movies, we do have enough adventures from his birth in 1899 all the way up until 1920. The years of this kid's life, a bunch of it we don't quite see because there's a big gap in between where a bunch of novels take place. Get ready for all the weird things that is Young Indiana Jones Adventures. Now, let me tell you, I love Indiana Jones. Am I the biggest fan of Indiana Jones of all time? Probably not. There's definitely things I'm a lot more into than Indiana Jones, but I really do love the Indiana Jones movies. I have the full collection of DVDs that I've had for years, which were obviously made before the 4th one came out, so great thanks, like right before it was announced. Thanks. But, you know, more importantly, weirdly enough, I had VHSs of those same movies for a long time, and a couple of the VHS movies of Young Indiana Jones. It always eluded me for years of what this was, because I knew that it was a TV show that was based on Indiana Jones, and I always wondered, what was it about, right? What could a young Indiana Jones do, right? What would young Indiana Jones really be, right? I thought it was very odd because I always, how could this kid go on weird adventures like the more adult Indiana Jones? Obviously, I was a kid at the time and didn't really have a lot of imagination, but I can tell you what I assumed this show was going to be, even leading up to me finally watching this, which was recently for this video. It's not what I expected it to be at all, right? I almost kind of expected it to be Indiana Jones goes on adventures in nearby areas because he's living in America, because he wouldn't travel, and maybe sometimes he would travel because he does belong to a more richer, American family. So sure, that maybe would make some sense. And when it even begins, I'm like, okay, this is kind of what I expected. But then as it goes on, oh my God, is it very much not what I expected. But also because of that, it ends up being very, very interesting. Every one of these episodes has an incredibly different tone than each other, right? While some of them are just as serious as the previous one or the next one in the chronological order that you gotta watch these in, some of them go in very different directions. And because most of these things are 2 smaller episodes put together, you get 2 all separate adventures happening one after another, and then some of which are very tonally different from each other and don't build off of each other. So you kind of like begin with this big epic battle, and then you end with like political talkings and romance, and you're like, what's even happening in this show? If you want to, you can watch this show on your own, and I would recommend it. If you're already an Indiana Jones fan and you want to learn more about Indiana, this stuff it exists. While the novels can be debated, this stuff is fully canon, right? This is officially fully canon, and it's on Disney Plus, right? Everything that happens in this is stuff that always had happened in the background of the movies that I'm sure you already know, because you have seen those, but have not seen this. Now, while you might find it a little bit weird that Indiana Jones isn't specifically played by Harrison Ford in this show, I must say that, A, it makes sense. It's about a younger Indiana Jones, and that man was like 20 years older than what he was in the first movie, so leave it be. But more importantly, obviously, he does show up in this show. He appears in the wraparound segments of Mystery of the Blues, and weirdly enough, that's not the only time where an older Indiana Jones is telling the story. As it was originally aired, George Hall played the even older Indiana Jones. He plays the then 93-year-old Indiana Jones as the future wraparound segments for most episodes take place in the actual year that these episodes were aired, weirdly enough. Or he has like an eye patch that, unfortunately, by the way, vague spoilers for the 5th movie, but that does not answer how he got that eye patch. And I kind of was hoping it. I don't know why they would have done that, but you know, at some point he gets an eye patch. I don't know. But besides a grandpa who is telling his grandkids who only vaguely care about his stories, the actual main Indiana Jones throughout the series is played by 2 actors. Corey Carrier plays the much younger Indiana Jones, like baby Indiana Jones, not baby Indiana Jones, but young little small boy Indiana Jones, while the majority of the show is the teen/young adult Indiana Jones, that being Sean Patrick Flanery. Sean Patrick Flanery, who now is a little bit younger than Harrison Ford was while filming the 4th Indiana Jones movie. The first movie, which I'm just going to refer to as episodes going forward, is My First Adventure, being 2 episodes of the earliest stuff that Indiana Jones ever did. The first ever part of this is indeed very young Indy, beginning this big, like, multi-year trek across the world as his father has multiple international business stuff that he does. We are introduced to his teacher, who is Helen Seymour, who at first you're like, ha, you old lady, just let Indiana do what he wants to do. And she ends up being a very likable and endearing character as the show goes on. Like, you genuinely really care about her and her well-being as certain bad things happen to her. Not that, like, horrible things happen to this lady, but she is a recurring member of the cast throughout this series, especially in this earlier continuity part of it. I really love her, but obviously at first she's the annoying teacher who's always on Indiana, but she does like to let him have some fun sometimes, and she does allow him and the 2 of them kind of climb a pyramid in Egypt and then kind of get lost until they're met by Lawrence, as in Lawrence of Arabia. Yeah, he really becomes a friend of Indiana and tells him all about this secret, potentially magical mummy treasure, which gets Indiana very interested in archaeology, which basically sets him on this path that he'll be on for the rest of the series, on wanting to go on to digs and adventures and find treasures, but not for like treasure's sake, but to like let them be treasured by other people, preferably in a museum, though we'll get to the in a museum part in a minute. Now that is Indiana Jones' first adventure, so his first adventure, the My First Adventure part, is literally done halfway during this. Now in his second adventure ever, he goes into Tangier, Morocco, where his family stays with a rich white family who, of course, have slaves. He now has to deal with the fact that slaves are a thing, and nearly, while they're exploring the town in Morocco, almost gets sold to slavery. So that's crazy that almost happened. The boy that he becomes friends with, Omar, is never really mentioned ever again, but it is mentioned in that same adventure, at least as it was originally aired, by the much older Indiana Jones, that Omar was later set free in 1911, following abolition of slavery in Morocco, and apparently became a sea captain and chose to travel the world. It's a wonder that Indiana never met him in his adventures. I kind of would want to see that character show up again. I almost expected it, because they gave a lot of attention to that character, but then he didn't. which, all right. Next up, Passion for Life. Passion for Life is one that's a little bit less, like, action-y, right? 2 episodes that involve just drama. The first half of Passion for Life is Indiana Jones is hanging with his family, who are hanging out with a group of hunters, which are led by Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt really gives him the idea of things need to be, like, captured to be put in museums, but he ends up kind of, like, shooting too many animals, which was a bit of a thing that man did, and kind of did to be reeled back a little bit, because that man, well, Teddy Roosevelt was cool, but he also really likes shooting things, but he does sort of give Indiana Jones this idea of things need to be preserved in order to continue it through history, just in case, I don't know, people hunt them near to destruction. He also gets lost in the African jungle while looking for the ability to find where these animals are, and it's kind of one of the only times we really get to see his dad worried. I didn't quite mention him in the first adventure there, but we do see several times his mom and father. His father, who's obviously not played by Sean Connery, is played by an actor who does a really great Sean Connery impression. Henry Jones Sr. is played by Lloyd Owen, and Anna Jones, his wife, is played by Ruth DeSouza. It's really cool to see these characters as they are, you know? You don't really get a good look at Indiana Jones's mom in really any of the movies, and you don't get that good of a look of what Henry Jones was to Indy when he was younger in his really only appearance in the movies, so it's cool to see these early parts in his life where his father's more in it than he ever was. The second half of this episode is he goes to Paris and kind of sneaks out multiple times to hang out with Picasso, which is just really fun. There's no, like, crazy adventures or action or, like, nothing all that crazy, but, like, you know, besides Picasso, who is absolutely nuts, because he was crazy, but like a good crazy. Not every episode needs to be some big fancy adventure. It can just be Indiana Jones has went to a new country and has met person and they have a wacky hijinks, and that's kind of all the show needs to be sometimes.
Okay, I like it, Picasso. Yeah, that way.
The Perils of Cupid, the third adventure, is very much the beginning of this thing which will constantly be a thing throughout the show. Spoilers, Indiana Jones is a big man whore. He will constantly fall for multiple women throughout the show. It will be a recurring thing, and only sometimes is any all that good. Perils of Cupid is 2 times where the romance in this show is very well written. The first part of it does involve Indiana Jones, as he becomes smitten with the daughter of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that being Princess Sophie. He constantly throughout the episode questions what love is and why it hurts people, to the point where he meets up with a couple psychologists, but not like because he's like going mad for this, but because his family happens to be going to a dinner with a few of them, one of which is, yes, Sigmund Freud, who makes it very awkward. And he basically, like, storms the friggin', like, royal palace twice in order to see her, and he does it, like, kind of successfully, but ultimately is talked down by Franz Ferdinand to be like, yo, calm it down, you're a poor boy, and that's not gonna happen. However, here's a plot I never expected to be in young Indiana Jones adventures. Giacomo Puccini is this passionate poet who wants to make a play and ends up being very smitten with, guess what, Indiana Jones's mom. And due to the fact that Senior is off going elsewhere, she is so lonely that she ends up being seduced by him, and though she never cheats on him, she nearly does, and even like admits to the tutor that she kind of wants to. And they have this like very complicated romance, which is a lot like more complicatedly written than I would have expected this show that I at first thought was a kid show, and secondly, was a show about Indiana Jones, not his mom about to have an affair. Travels with Father is the 4th film and is the 4th made-for-TV film that originally ended the series. It is a real good look into the relationship between Senior and Indy as they really go on adventures specifically together, and it's just very fun. The two of them have a big argument, and thus Indiana actually just like runs away and meets up with Leo Tolstoy of all people, and the two of them are about to like run away together. Not like, so you have this like funny like annoying little boy and goofy old man, and it's just like, it's really funny and endearing, and I actually really enjoy this section of the episode. But eventually Tolstoy and Indiana realize that they can't just like run away from their problems, and they have to go back to their family, and there's this very nice moment between the two, and that continues onward into the next section of it. As the two of them go to Greece, they start trying to connect, they spend some alone time together, and they end up actually getting lost while trying to prove the teachings of Aristotle travel, and they go on this little goofy adventure where they nearly like lose their clothes to some birds, and they end up going into the mountains where they're lifted up in this big cage which gets stuck, and they have to figure a way out of it, where we find out that Senior is afraid of heights. I think that's a thing in the movie, but if not, there's a fun fact. It's very cool, and it's a good little moment between Senior actually like trusting his son for once ever, and probably maybe the last time. The last appearance of little young Indiana Jones happens continuously after Travels with Father, though honestly you could probably watch it either way. It's probably the most boring one, right? The whole entire of the first half of Journey of Radiance is basically young Indiana going, "What's religion? What's religion? Hey, what's religion?" This is where I thought that for a little bit this show may have been made for kids and to be educational, because oh my god, do they like directly try to explain to you every religion? Like, listen, I've been through history class. I know what Buddhism is. The second half of the episode is Indiana nearly dies from sickness, which they aren't able to get actual medicine for because they're like deep in the like middle of nowhere, Kansas, China. Obviously, Indiana Jones does not die in this episode, but it's just very funny how they try to make us think that young Indiana Jones was about to die. We then skip 6 whole years into the future for My Spring Break Adventure, the real beginning of teen young adult Indiana Jones' section of the show. Personally, I feel like the actor of very younger Indiana Jones is just kind of all right, you know? He's fine. He's a kid. He's not going to be that fantastic. He does a fine job, though. It's clear that this kid had some more potential in his future. If he went to some more acting lessons, could have been good. But besides playing Lampwick in 1996's Adventures of Pinocchio, yes, that Pinocchio, he never really went into the entertainment business. But I must say that after this show, he has been remembered and has been given multiple times VIP passes to multiple Indiana Jones rides, one of which, that being the Epic Stunt Spectacular, is where he proposed to his partner. So, good on you, dude. In the in-between years, there is indeed multiple adventures. River Phoenix plays younger Indiana Jones, the in-between between youngest Indiana Jones and young Indiana Jones, and it's this Indiana Jones that George Lucas thought looked a lot like a young Harrison Ford, which no, he doesn't. That ultimately goes on multiple adventures similar to what he did when he was younger, going on certain worldly adventures with either his father or with his best friend's own father. Also just stuff that happens to be just around in America, all of which is while he is in the Boy Scouts learning lots of different survival techniques, which he has to use in order to get away from certain perilous adventures. None of which are all too crazy, but one of which he does meet up with one of the major characters of the Indiana Jones franchise when he's in Egypt, stopping this threat of the Germans, stopping some British trade routes, stopping some revolutionary plot on a Russian princess, stopping people from getting ancient artifacts that might be vaguely tied into Atlantis, question mark, getting back this treasure for this girl named Lizzie that goes on with him with a couple adventures. Not gonna go too in detail, but it's cool that there is some recurring characters in his younger days for some of these books. And one of the adventures is him just on the Titanic. Straight up, continuity-wise, again, books, a little bit wonky, but like, one of these books has him and his tutor survive the Titanic. Yes, actually, My Spring Break Adventure is really where the series begins, right? Now, it was weird when it started, but it's really weird now, right? The first half of this begins basically what I assumed the show was going to be. Weird, wacky hijinks of Indiana foiling some kind of weird plot that's happening right now. He wants to go to the prom, so he's got to get a car. So he has to get a thing to make that car work, because cars worked weirdly in the 1910s. So we can't, but after getting help from some weird inventor, who then gets kidnapped by the Germans, who then ends up being not kidnapped by the Germans, and with help of the actor of Phil Coulson, they're able to figure out that he'd like faked his kidnapping to sell like the oil to people who actually want to get it. Mostly because he was working for Thomas Edison, and as Thomas Edison does, he was taking all of the credit. So, but still though, 16-year-old Indiana Jones is able to get a fun car for the prom, and they got a weird, wacky mystery hijinks of who is the killer. Ooh, right? That's not what the rest of the show is, right? That's what I expected it for the rest of the time to be. No, because you know what happens soon afterwards? He then goes after the prom once again to another adventure somewhere out in the world. They go to Albuquerque. With his cousin Frank, they go to Columbus. They just kind of hang around, but because they're in New Mexico, they find out that some town is being attacked by some raiders, and they end up getting involved in the Mexican Revolution. Indy just leaves his vacation and goes to the Mexican Revolution. At first, he kind of just gets kidnapped, and he's like, I'd better leave. The leader of the Mexican Revolution is like, yeah, you would leave. Go back to your cozy life, white boy. Just crazy. It's a lot of blowing shit up, people racing around, going on big, crazy battles, like an actual bloody war is happening in Mexico at that time. So, yeah. However, him and his Belgian friend, Remy, who he meets in the Mexican Revolution, go, you know what, this was important, but this isn't our war. We should join the real war that's happening, which is World War I. Now we get to a big chunk of the show, which is the World War I arc. So, Indiana Jones is a soldier in World War I. This is weirdly where a lot of the show went, and to where a lot of its budget went very clearly, and where a lot of the adventures happen. Of course, they don't go into the war immediately. In Love's Sweet Song, they are in Ireland, doing odd jobs, mostly as people working for this restaurant, to try and find enough money to eventually build up to get to an actual, ship to Belgium, so that they could enlist in the Belgian army. A lot of the episode is Indy trying to impress a woman named Maggie, while her brother Sean keeps trying to get support for the IRA to eventually, start the big revolution, which is started in the end of this episode, which, while it clearly does do something and will lead history-wise to eventually Ireland mostly being separate from Great Britain. Again, whole other topic that I am not the right person to get into it. It does lead into our characters fully understanding what this sort of thing could mean and what it could lead to, and what is the importance of fighting for your beliefs. And I really like it. The second half of this episode is the real reason I really love this episode. As they're able to get enough money to get a boat to London, they wait for them to finally be sent off, and during this time, Indiana Jones meets with who is basically the love of his life, Vicky Prentiss, who is probably the best written romance in this entire show. I love her, and these two characters' relationship is the most believable and sad of the whole series. This should have been Endgame, all right? I don't care about anyone else. This is what should have showed up later on, all right? If they sell me on this in what is like barely an hour, and I wanted to see this succeed, it's really cool. She's really independent. She fully believes in what she fights for. And while Indy's like basically about to be like, let's get married, she's like, we're in two very different situations, and God knows after the war, we're gonna be two different people. So it's not gonna work out. And you're like, damn it. But I want it to work out. And by the end, when he's leaving and he says goodbye and he waves goodbye to her, it's just this like deep pit in my heart forever. Also, Remy, who I love, by the way, because he's this goofy, funny man who will be in the next several episodes, gets married to some random girl in London who has kids, which, weirdly, that relationship works out. Indiana Jones Adventures, specifically Young Indiana Jones Adventures, was going to be about fun, like, roaming around the world and getting treasures. No, here's him in the trenches of hell. Now that they've joined the Belgian army, they've realized, oh my god, this is horrible. And in a very vivid, realistic depiction of World War I, we get horrible trench warfare and our characters nearly dying through grenades and gunshots and flamethrower and gas attacks. It's horrifying. Remy nearly dies, which will not be the last time that happens. And what makes this worse is the second half of this episode, the second adventure in this, is Indy is specifically sent out to go help a captured army soldier and this gets him captured in this biggest maximum security prison like ever. Well, it's a little bit goofy at first in that some Russians try to escape it, which they do horribly. Indy's able to learn from this and is able to very subtly escape. And it's honestly a very tense whole episode, but while there is parts of levity throughout it, mostly because we just saw trench warfare, so we kind of need a little bit, it still takes itself very seriously and doesn't like make it seem like a very goofier, lesser part part of the episode. I'm very glad the whole series wasn't as serious as these 2 episodes, because it probably would have been a slog to get through. The next episode is Demons of Deception. Demons of Deception is another episode right smack dab in the middle of World War I. Indy is able to be a Belgian courier who brings messages back and forth in France, and is basically forced to be a spy in order to find out what the Germans are doing. And though he nearly dies in order to get this information, the people who are in charge basically ignore it because why not? We don't get too much of Remy, but we get him in the second half of this, where him and Remy go to Paris on leave, and they have this nice little funny romantic adventure. And while Remy's out there having a good time with some French girls, Annie meets Mata Hari. Mata Hari, who is this temptress who, at first, a lot of people are like, don't trust her, she's a belly dancer. And you're like, huh, what a bunch of prudes. I hope Indy is able to have a fun time with this cool girl that I'm sure won't cause any problems. And while it's cool that Indiana definitely gets laid here, let's go, Indy, she ends up being, like, very horrible, and is very clearly a gold digger who is using him to just, like, move her stuff from one place to another that she is now getting due to money from sleeping with the Secretary of Defense. So yeah, she is suspected of being a spy, which ultimately is what pushes Indiana away from her and stops his leave cut short so that he can't really say goodbye to her all that well. And there's scenes that are throughout this, like, ending part of the episode that show that she may have been tried to be a spy. Even if she was or not, she was tried to be a spy and was set fire by a firing squad. So now here's an adventure that's a lot lighter. Indiana Jones and the Phantom Train of Dune. No, it doesn't involve a giant ghost train. Indiana and Remy, after being given the new rank of lieutenant, accidentally get on the wrong train in Africa and get lost twice. So now they're found by some people who are in a very different group, and they're told, hey, we'll let the Belgian army know that you didn't desert, so you don't get put onto a firing squad, because it still is World War I. But we will have to have you help us get this Phantom Train. He is then set on with this group called the Old and the Bold, the 25th Frontier Battalion, led by Frederick Sillis, a famed hunter which Indy met years ago while on safari with Teddy Roosevelt. Haha, cool continuity. There are a bunch of goofy old guys that are supposedly the, like, top in their field, but they're also weird and wild, and this would be awesome as its own whole movie. Unfortunately, the actual Phantom Train part is only the first half, but it could have totally been like a whole, like, big spy sort of heist-esque film adventure thing where we could have, like, gotten to learn these characters more. I would have totally been down for this section being a whole entire episode or movie if they just, like, expanded it in, like, a longer format. Honestly, someone write that down, make it your own movie, I'll watch it. But the group basically forces Indy and Remy as unwitting pawns in their next scheme to try and capture this German general, which Indy and Remy totally accidentally capture on their own after trying to escape a bunch of the German army on a hot air balloon, and they're very quickly found by the German army like 3 times in the episode. Like, they are right across the hill. Like, I swear to God, 3 times someone on the German side's like, oh, I bet you wouldn't expect the German army across the hills. Like, how are they so fast? Jesus. But thankfully they're able to escape, nearly get eaten by some lions, and then unfortunately kind of have to just let him go after the German army finds them again. Very easily, mind you. They then continue their adventures in Africa in Oganga, the giver and taker of light. They basically constantly go back and forth with their general on whether or not they should bring this little child and whether or not they should, like, go against the wishes of the soldiers there. And Indy and Remy do side with the African soldiers to go against that guy, which ends up being the total right call, though that general does die in the process, not because any of them killed them, but because he got injured and then sick and then died. But thankfully, the place that they brought him in order to lay him to rest happened to have this very cool doctor guy who, against the wishes of his people, as he is a German doctor, is out here helping the people of Africa. However, due to the fact that he is German, he is thought to be of some kind of threat or spy, so the French military ultimately tell him to get lost. Germany has to get messed up in every aspect in order for, you know, the thing to happen. I do love these two, by the way. They have this very fun, very entertaining relationship. The two actors clearly have a lot of chemistry, and I do love to see them. interact and go through these many different hijinks, which unfortunately does bring us to the end of the World War I arc, leading into the spy Indy arc. Our two main characters now go into the French Secret Service in order to get into the, not the front lines, but stuff that may actually be important to help make the war end a lot sooner. The two of which are sent in two very different directions, which unfortunately separates them, which in this very touching moment of them hugging, potentially not going to see each other for a very long time, it got to me, man. I love these two guys. I love them. They're so great. People are going to ask me, I don't know why they would, or if they would, who my favorite Indiana Jones character is, and I'm going to say Remy, and that person theoretically asking is going to be like, who's that? And I'm gonna be like, watch the show, dude. Watch the show. You don't understand the best bromance of television, I swear to God. Thankfully, not the last time we see Remy, but that moment still, man, it gets to me. So we don't get to see Remy for a little bit here, but we do get into this weird spy arc of now Indiana is gonna go on these strange adventures in espionage. In the beginning of his spy's adventures, he's sort of this reconnaissance photographer and is told to go photograph stuff while on a plane. During this time, he gets in the middle of a fight with the Red Baron. Yeah, the Red Baron. The thing that Snoopy fights all the time. The guy basically shoots down Indiana and the guy who was flying the plane. But weirdly enough, that's not really the whole point of the episode. They basically let him go after the Red Baron tells Indiana that he actually wants to fight the, leader of the squad. And they, get into this dogfight that, of course, the Red Baron wins because he's the Red Baron and Snoopy will never catch him. Really, that same character is a major part of the next separate part of this episode that ultimately Indiana has to go infiltrate this big, aromatic genius as he's about to sell secrets to Germany, and Indiana has to convince him to not do that, while also pretending to not be Indiana Jones. It's a little bit of a comedic part of the episode, but it's something that does still fit with the seriousness of the actual events of the episode. Indy is nearly caught, but is able to escape with some secrets, specifically the recently made triplane, the one of several things that were made to try and make planes better during the time. Now, adventures in the Secret Service. And also very quickly talking about espionage escapades. Adventures in the Secret Service. Indiana Jones is tasked with bringing two guys to Karl I of Austria in order to try and get Austria onto the side of the Allies and away from Germany. Count Cernan, played by the absolutely fantastic Christopher Lee, is ultimately in charge of making the actual note that will be sent to the Allies, which then Karl secretly sneaks the draft that he wants to be shown to the Allies to Indiana. It's this very quaint little spy adventure of him trying to get past enemy lines in order to get to the important people. It shows you the genuine craftiness that Indiana has in order to get past people, and the fact that he has clearly learned a lot in order to get around these situations instead of just getting right into the fight. The second half of this episode is one of 3 episodes that were written by this one writer who I'm not that big of a fan of in terms of his episodes of this show. The second half of Adventures of Secret Service is in Petrograd in 1917, ultimately about Indiana making friends with some people who are, of course, Leninists, and we get an entire speech. Lenin has a whole speech that we have to listen to, which is okay, I didn't sign up for this. And while he tries to convince some Leninists to not march as they're about to be shot down, he isn't able to do so. And that's all that really happens in it. The exact same writer would write both parts of Espionage Escapades, 2 episodes I just really don't like. This for me is probably the worst whole big episode of the whole series, right? 2 whole segments which are just not great and not well written at all. One of which is really, really not funny as it tries to be very, very funny. Indy meets up with some people at Barcelona who they basically try to make this elaborate prop to disrupt the balance of diplomatic power. And in order to do that, they have to make fake jobs, and one of which they have to get Indy into this ballet. And God, is it really, really boring. The second half of it is even worse as he goes to Prague and has to make a very important call, which he can't do because they took out his phone from the hotel, and he goes through multiple hoops to eventually get a phone and eventually get it hooked up. But it's this constant big comedy of errors of bad things keep happening to Indy the entire 3 days he's there in Prague, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And by that I mean, it's a horrible episode. Yeah, absolute worst episodes. If you ever needed to like skip an episode because you want to watch all this but like not all of it, then yeah, skip this one. You can just do that. Daredevils in the Desert is also one that also isn't fantastic. Indiana kind of has to now trek through the desert as he goes on this secret mission in order to find out what's happening in a certain town and whether or not they're able to actually invade it. They're trying to fake that this isn't the main invasion spot and that it will be somewhere else. But unfortunately, the woman that he was working with ends up being a double agent, which, how did that happen? Did we not look into this lady's background? Like, I know this is World War I, but like, come on there. That feels like that shouldn't have happened, honestly. At the very least, the cool Australian guys that he meets during this episode are able to like trick the cannon guys who are shooting at them by just running on in and getting there in such a way that it's not the posh way that the British would have done it, which would have gotten them killed. And it's just hey, cool, the Australians were awesome, and actually it did help during World War I. And that's like the whole episode. This is one of those that like actually was a whole episode. Again, most of these episodes, as they were originally aired, were all like 1 hour, and this is one of those that they just kept as it was because it just was paced well enough. Now, while I don't think it's that well written, because again, I feel like the female spy that they have alongside him just isn't that well written of a character, and just really is, quote, female spy. I really think they should have did more with her, and the fact that they just don't, it just feels pointless. Speaking of pointless romances, Tales of Innocence, 2 episodes that are about Indiana Jones falling in love. 2 in 1 really shows you the just ease that Indiana goes to just immediately falling in love. The first half of it is kind of funny. He has this vague rivalry with a guy he's not sure about, and he gets advice from Ernest Hemingway, yes, actually, on what he should do. It's very funny, it's very comical, and it ends up being the fact that Ernest Hemingway is that guy, and they end up getting in a big fight, eventually being like, girls, am I right? Bros before hoes, which, you know what, with Ernest Hemingway, all right, I'll accept it. But the second half of it is kind of all right. Indiana Jones falls in love with Julia from Hellraisers 1 and 2, who's playing real-life novelist Edith Wharton, who is quite a little bit older than Indiana, like 30 years older than Indiana, and honestly, this whole episode just feels weird, and while the actual, like, espionage stuff they does and, like, uncovering this big secret thing with some guys smuggling some guns is actually very interesting, it's the like romance part that's the major part of the episode, and it's just really boring. Like, I don't care. Like, I really don't care throughout the episode. After what happened in Paris, a lot of these have have big shoes to fill, but you know, none of them really even feel close to how well written that one was, and certainly not this one. Now, at the ripe end of World War I, we get to the last little bits of what Indiana was doing during the war. There's a bit of a continuity issue that is presented. The second segment of the series is presented as happening in January 1918, while the first segment is presented in September, while the film version of it basically adds in reshoots that add little bits that show that the Istanbul part happened before the Transylvania part, vaguely somewhere in the middle of 1918. Either way, one half of this episode is kind of alright, and the other half of this episode is weird. Indiana Jones pretends to be this Swedish man. He gets engaged to a woman named Molly Wilder, who is fully in love with him. This is probably what is closest to what I feel like is a good written romance in this series. It is fine. Catherine Butler is a really great actress, and she is a very believable character as Molly Wilder, and I feel like the romance here had some potential. If they had spent more time on this episode and had allowed that romance to actually build up, it could have been a lot more interesting. Having us see him meet her and their relationship, this like romance that would have led to him proposing, would have been really great. But we never get that. They've like already been engaged and they're about to get married like a while from now, and she ends up finding out that Indy isn't a Swedish man and he's from America, and while she at first is like, I can't believe you, she then comes back. But unfortunately, when she comes back, she happens to get right in the middle of what Indy's doing with the Austrians and gets shot. We don't really get to see this relationship grow, and we don't really get to see this relationship really become something that's worth being sad about. I don't necessarily am like, yippee, a lady died, but like, I don't fully care about this relationship. It's something that I feel like did have potential. It just didn't grow to be anything good. This makes him super sad, so the French people basically send him off to Transylvania. He's sent into this spooky castle to find out what happened to certain soldiers who were taken out of a POW camp. His group's led by this guy who ends up being a German double agent who is also really wondering what happened to their POWs. And what ends up happening is that they were, stay with me, they were turned into vampires. They were turned into vampires by this Count Dracula looking motherfucker, who was probably actually Dracula, who was probably actually Vlad the Impaler, because he just full on impales people in front of his house. He has magical electrical orbs hanging around, which can just burst people into flames, because they do in this episode. Indiana Jones throws him off a bridge, and with help of the last surviving member of their group, they're able to just bring him in the middle of a field and stake him in the heart, which kills him. This is never questioned by the characters, and the fact that they had just fought a vampire and how absolutely wild this episode is. Oh my god, if you're gonna watch anything from this show, make it be the episode where Indiana Jones fights an actual vampire. How were they allowed to do this? Was this part of the 70 adventures that Lucas wrote down? Did George Lucas write down Indiana Jones fought a vampire because he just was bored that day and went, yeah, fuck it, why not? That's insane. That's insane that just happened and we just move on. Indiana Jones just moves on from that and never questions it for the rest of his life. But now that we're done with the spy arc, we get into the last little bit of the series, which is what I'm going to call the college arc. Even though not all of it is during college, it's still leading into the later parts of Indy's life, so it's still that. We get into Treasure of the Peacock's Eye. Treasure of the Peacock's Eye is all about him and Remy going off for fun little adventures and going to treasure hunting. You know, the thing that Indiana Jones does. It's a very thrilling adventure of these characters trying to find this box that seemingly holds this gem from this golden peacock that Alexander the Great once had. They uncover where it might be, they try and triangulate it, they get in the mix of some other evil people trying to find it. They find this one lady who ends up being this double agent who tries to help them, and it should have been a lot longer for that section of it, because it ends up not being. If that was any longer and the big final fight was on the boat that the middle of this episode ends up being, then this probably would have been an awesome movie. I was having a great time with the beginning whole half of this episode. It is actually really great. The problem is it ends so poorly. They're able to get the box. They aren't able to get the key, but they're like, we're just gonna find a way to open it. We're just gonna get out. But then they end up going to an island. They row so far that they get away from the general area where anyone lives, and they end up getting to an island where natives are. And for the next 20 minutes, they do some stuff with the natives who seemingly are about to kill him and then aren't, and then seemingly about to kill him and then aren't. Where, of course, a British man happens to be researching these guys, and he thankfully is able to just bring them into his hut, where he's able to help them open the box, which ends up having a stone. Remy once again is very rightfully angry. And even though Indiana seemingly starts looking into what these symbols on this stone might mean and where it might lead, the episode ends with Indiana going, you know what, I should just go back to college. And Remy's like, yeah, I guess. Maybe this treasure hunting thing isn't as good as we thought. No, that should be the mid part of the thing. If that tribal thing didn't take that long and they quickly found the guy and figured out where that was gonna go, and the bad guys from earlier found them and they went in this big final fight, that would have been perfectly fine. And that double agent girl that was helping them, that I mentioned earlier, just dies during that boat fight in the middle of it. And if she just kept along with them, we could have built her as this believable romance, because it was starting to feel like one in the beginning of the story. It's so aggravating that the second half of Treasure of the Peacock's Eye is just so boring and nothing, and it just ends on, we're going home, the end. And it's come on. Now we get to the final 4 episodes of the show, the rest of the actual college arc. It begins with Winds of Change, ultimately being about him coming back home, but at first getting work as a translator in the Paris Peace Conference. It is a lot of delegating and a lot of politic stuff, which happened in real life, and though it's very interesting to see the actual real life stuff as someone who's interested in history, why is Indiana Jones here? This barely feels like an Indiana Jones adventure, and it's if you want to know what happened during the peace conferences in Paris, you can look it up online. It's all very interesting, and all the delegation and stuff that I'm interested in, but when watching Indiana Jones, no. None of it really feels like something that Indiana Jones should even be there for. But he's able to come home, though, in the second half of this episode is much more interesting. We really do get this connecting moment between him and his father, as the two of them begin to really show that they are very different people than they were 3 years ago. Indiana really starts, like, standing up for himself and deciding that he's gonna go where he wants to go, and we almost have this moment of connection with him and his father, which I really enjoy, but it ends up quickly going back as he goes, I'm not gonna go to Princeton, I'm going to where I want to go, which his dad, of course, as he always does, is like, well, do what you want, Junior. Like, there was almost something there, and it makes sense, and it's not like The Peacock's Eye, where it's like an episode where I didn't want it to end that way. It's more like, I know it has to end that way, and damn it, it's like I want them to, like, be better, but you know they kind of can't because there's a movie about that later. We also do get him meeting up with Paul Robeson. We really get to see racism firsthand years before the civil rights movement, which is something that's pretty much important for this episode and the next part when we get to Mystery of the Blues. Mystery of the Blues is indeed a much better showing of racial tensions in the 1920s as Indiana Jones becomes good friends with some jazz and blues band, which are all really cool and played by actors that you have seen before in other things. He, of course, sucks at jazz at first, but then eventually learns to not be as bad as jazz. And that's the first hour of this episode. It takes way too long for him to learn how to do the jazz, and it also once again feels like a show that might have been educational at one point where they teach him the, like, basics of jazz. I feel like I should have been, like, trying to try out my saxophone finally by just watching the episode and playing along it. I don't have a saxophone, by the way, but I wish I did. Also, it's weird that Indy is very into jazz. This is like a weird part of this character that's never in anything ever again. So it's weird that he just had this aspect to him in his early life. It's so odd. Second half of it is the actual mystery part of it, right? Indiana, who at this point is still working to get money for his college, ends up now needing to deal with the fact that his boss had been murdered by some kind of mob hit. It's very unclear who's the one who did it, but they end up finding out that it's someone named Al. Big Al. Big Al Capone, by the way. And one of the people who's helping Indy try to find this is not only Ernest Hemingway, but also the guy who in real life would later find Al Capone and bust him. Mystery of the Blues is a very interesting episode, as of course the wraparounds are not the super old Indy, it's the slightly older Indy, an Indy who's like 20 years older than he was in the actual movies, who's still kind of going on smaller adventures and decides just in a cabin to talk about the fact that he really likes jazz. The Scandal of 1920, another episode that was specifically just one big long episode that they kept the way it was. It is my least favorite episode. Now, I said I hated another episode before, but this one's probably like right up with it. 90s was always full of, oops, I ended up doing a bad thing and I can't possibly explain it to that person, so I better try and keep up this lie until it blows up in my face. And that's what happens in this episode. He falls in love with 3 girls at a time and isn't able to tell one of them that he's not able to not date them because he's already dating someone else. Of course, all 3 find out that they are dating the same guy, so weirdly, right when people are celebrating Indiana's birthday, they shove his face into a cake. That's just how the episode ends. They're just like, haha, that's what you get. And it's like, man, if this was like any other character, I'd probably feel that these characters were justified, and they are, obviously, because, wow, Indy, why did you do that? But I feel like that's not what I want to see from Indiana Jones. I don't want to see him just like be an idiot and like do this kind of thing and be justifiably beat up by people that he had wronged, you know? Indy in this show is kind of like a childhood friend that you have, and you have like a lot of like fun adventures with them, and you have a good time with them normally for the most part. But then they say something very troubling and you're like, oh yeah, that's you also. Oh, why did you say that? Which weirdly continues in the very final episode chronologically, that being Hollywood Follies. Hollywood Follies is 2 kind of just plain episodes that really do feel like they were randomly in the middle of the show rather than a big finale. Now, trying to get more money to continue going to his college, he ends up taking some odd jobs where he's able to get a job from this producer in Hollywood who really needs him to shut down this movie by this crazy German director who constantly adds more and more and more and more to his films and won't stop. After some crazy, wacky hijinks, they're able to shut down the movie and are able to get it cut print and moved out. Unfortunately, things don't work the way he needs to, so he has to go to another job in Hollywood Hood and becomes a stuntman. Well, at first he's just kind of helping in the background and even tries to be an actor, which he fails horribly, which is just funny. He does become a stuntman and helps the movie come to a conclusion, and it ends up being greater because of his acting. Quote unquote. But that's it for Young Indiana Jones Adventures. It is a very fun show, right? If you want to get into more weird adventures of a much younger Indiana Jones, of his formative years on why he became the man he was and why he went to the field he did and how he learned how to do all this crazy adventuring stuff, then it's a very good idea to look at Young Indiana Jones Adventures. Technically, we get a good idea of how he learned how to use a whip, but we never really get to see him get his whip. And again, the hat is only in like a little bit of episodes. The show was not what I expected it to be, right? This is not the show it really should have been also, right? This should have been more about going on fun hijinks and adventures around the world, or at least in America, hunting for treasure and fighting bad guys. That's the show I wanted to see when I heard Young Indiana Jones Adventures, right? Despite that, a lot of this show is very well-written character drama that I feel like really expands into Indiana Jones as a character. It shows you sides about this character that I never expected to really ever see, because I didn't know that they were there, right? The fact that he's a very thoughtful, really caring, perspective person who has a lot of hope for the world and for humanity that it will change shows you that he's this very idealistic dreamer, which you don't really get from this more like rugged type character that is this typical action guy in the movies. Now, I'm looking with this going into the movies, I'll really see if that really makes sense, because as I remember right now, it doesn't too much, but it's cool to see that at least when he was younger, he did have this side to him, which was a lot more idealistic and a lot more joyful. I feel like this adds not just a lot to Indiana, but also his dad, and we really get to see the basics of their relationship and how it was, how they connected, and how they quickly fell apart as much as they want to reconnect, as well as the beginnings of what eventually led him to become an archaeology teacher and an archaeologist, and what will eventually lead him to the adventures we see in the original. Would have loved to have seen more of this though, right? There's just a lot more to be seen from the Avengers, especially afterwards. I would love to see the formative years after him going to college, you know, him becoming a professor, him going to France, and learning there to really become the archaeology teacher, and the eventual years we lead up into the movies. Now, I'll get into those adventures and what eventually leads into the movies there when I talk about those actual movies, and a little bit of an extra fun thing, but in terms of Young Indiana Jones Adventures, what we do have here is a lot of interesting little adventures going from place to place in lots of weird places I didn't expect, right? Mother seducing, vampires, trench foot, phantom trains. It's a crazy show that I should absolutely recommend to you. If you love fun adventure shows with a weirdly big budget than it probably should have had, and shows which weirdly do teach you about history alongside the fun adventures, and of course you love Indiana Jones, then Young Indiana Jones Adventures is absolutely the kind of show you should watch. All of the characters introduced in this, both fictional and real, are all very well written and are all very well acted. There's a lot of actors that you've seen in other stuff in this show that I didn't expect to see, and seeing much younger versions of actors that I've seen in more recent stuff that I know them from is really cool, right? There's a whole bunch of cameos from people that you've seen in other stuff, or had careers beforehand, and this is like in their later years. It's really cool. And a lot of the characters that they introduced in this show are very good interpretations of these characters in real life. They're all respectable if they should be, and aren't if they are, you know? If they're much bad people, they make sense, right? They don't necessarily take this like definite stance on history though. It's World War I, it's a little bit more easier to be like, not all of them were bad, they were just doing some dumb shit. So like obviously the Red Baron's real easy to be like, he was evil, but like he wasn't. He was just a soldier who was really good at what he was doing, and they portray that sort of thing very well. They don't necessarily make people some kind of like evil cartoony villain, which they could have easily have done. There's different shades of people, and they do a really good job showing that in this show. Having the different supporting cast members, whether it be Indiana Jones' multiple friends or love interests or his own family, all of which have their own multifaceted characters, each of which get us into different sides of them as we see them more. Now that being said, this show isn't perfect, right? There are several episodes, several parts of episodes that just aren't good. There are some characters that are clearly just made up for the show or not all that well written versions of real life people that are just very clearly throwaway characters that they just made or put in there to quickly fill a space, right? They're very one-dimensional and they're not all that great. And that's most of Indiana Jones' love interests, right? A lot of them are really boring, waste a lot of time, and I want to see fun adventures. You want to have a romance, fine, but what I want to see is young Indiana Jones whipping around, beating up guys, you know? And that stuff's there, and it's some interesting mystery and some interesting espionage stuff. It's really good, right? And you could have that romance and have it be better written alongside that, and they don't have that a lot of the time. By the end of the show, I was starting to realize that, again, Indiana Jones, real big man whore. That man would not stop falling in love with people very easily because it kept happening, and you're like, Indy, stop it. Stop it so much. By the end of this, though, I really enjoyed it as I was watching it, and I wanted to keep watching it. By the end, I was kind of ready to be done, right? I was ready to move on from the constant romances and the constant weird plots that I don't know why Indiana Jones was even in them in the first place. It really does feel like we don't necessarily need like multiple adventures to happen every year for Indiana. You could probably just skip a couple years and have him do something now. You know, that works out. You probably could have had like more stuff to experience in Indiana Jones' life had you like not had most of it be during World War I. And again, those episodes, oh god, the ones I mentioned where it's mostly bad romance or mostly bad comedy, like really, really bad comedy, are probably some of the biggest offenders in this show of just really not knowing what they wanted to do with the ideas that they were presented. And I don't know why you just did that instead of going with, you know, what we want to see. Though this show isn't what I wanted to see, it did end up being something still very entertaining because this show is more good than it is bad. It's got a lot of great actors, it's got mostly really great episodes with a lot of good people who are behind this show. It clearly had a lot of attention to detail in it in terms of continuity, in terms of historical accuracy. It's really great with that stuff. There is not a thing that I questioned besides the like vampire stuff and Prague that I went, yeah, that's probably like that was changed for the show. Like, no, a lot of this is very correct and is what happened in real life, more or less. And I love stuff like that. If you're gonna set it in history, you gotta have it around history because history still happened in this world, right? So you gotta have it make sense. And they really do. And I really respect this show and the amount of effort that went into it. Those war scenes, any battle scene or action scene had so much detail put into it. It had so much effort put into making it look good and actually look comprehensive and work in the way that it did. This show had way more of a budget than it actually needed to have, but I'm glad it did. Sean Patrick Flanery has thankfully continued to act because he just genuinely is a really great actor with a lot of range to him. He can really go from this much more serious guy to a much more goofier interpretation, so he clearly has a lot that he could work with, and I'm glad he's still getting work. He's worked in the show Dead Zone, in Young and the Restless, the Boondock Saints movies, and has recently been in a movie like this exact year called Nefarious, and though I don't know if it's good or not, it's just cool that he still is getting work all these years later, because he deserves it. He's a really great actor. And if this series really needs to just have Harrison Ford, and I feel like now we're a little bit too late, but I feel like if there ever needs to be a replacement, then, you know, Sean Patrick Flanery probably would be the right guy, right? The years afterwards leading up to the original movie and the adventures during those movies and a little bit afterwards is the stuff we'll be getting into next time, with the real important stuff that people really know about with the Indiana Jones movies. Now that we've gotten to his formative years, we can sort of go into it with all this knowledge of who he was as a character and then kind of go into it and analyze these movies with that idea. I think that'll be very interesting, and if you want to see that, then go ahead and make sure you subscribe and leave this video a like and support it in any way you can. Share it to everyone you possibly can. Whip that like button. Whip it. Whip it good. But most importantly, stay good. Stay safe. Don't be an asshole.